Good afternoon, everyone who is joining us from Facebook and YouTube and those who are interested in the strategic communication. My name is Marius Varna. I am the senior expert at NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence located here in Riga in Latvia. And today we have a really interesting topic to discuss, and we will be looking at the Russia strategic exercises. So I will start with short teaser. So NATO's StratCom COE is about to publish a new analysis paper on Russian strategic exercises Kavkaz 2020. So those who are interested in how Russia is communicating, how Russia is using its strategic exercises as tool to deliver certain messages, what target audiences did those exercises aimed at, we're always looking you at our websites, follow our newsletters, and soon you will hear more about these exercises and what we found out. So today, during the traditional StratCom talks, experts in Russian military affairs and propaganda, as well as in disinformation, provide their insights of the last year's Kavkaz 2020 Russian exercises. And of course, we will touch the upcoming Russian exercises Zapad 2021. Without further ado, I would like to introduce two of the speakers who will go with us this hour, and we will discuss how Russia is using exercises and communicating them. So my first speaker today is Mr. Valery Akimenko. He is the research lead on Russia and Ukraine with Conflict Studies Research Center in the United Kingdom. For 2.5 decades, Mr. Valery Akimenko has covered political and military developments in the former Soviet space for the BBC monitoring services, specializing in Russian military, hard security, and power projection issues. Mr. Akimenko is co-author of the previous NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence study on strategic Russian exercises Vostok 2018, Center 2019, and Grom 2019. He also greatly contributed to the latest publication, which is about to be published, and he is joining us today with his opinion, with his findings on what he got by looking at the Kavkaz exercises. My second speaker who is joining us today is Mr. Vaidas Saldžiūnas, a journalist from Lithuania. He is a defense correspondent at Delphi, largest online media group in Lithuania as well as in the Baltics. His work has ranged from specialist Russian military media environment, guides and comprehensive general overviews on the structure and capabilities of the Russian armed forces, to more narrowly focused products on specific Russian military subjects. For example, Russia's space program and militarization of the Arctic, nuclear weapons and submarine fleet, to the conflict in Eastern and Russia's Syria's deployment. So Mr. Vaidas Saldžiūnas will help us to explain how media, how the journalists see what Russia is exercising during its strategic exercises such as Kavkaz and upcoming Zapad 21. So Valera, the floor is yours. So what are the key findings from Kavkaz 2020? What are the narratives? Did you see some new trends, new I don't know, tricks that Russia is using to showcase its military capabilities and to what target audiences? Valera, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marius. Good afternoon, esteemed audience. To coin your phrase, Marius, without further ado, I shall proceed to present this report, which was co-written, let me remark, by three of our distinguished expert contributors, Mr. Davis Petraitis, Dr. Vera Radzabarinska, and Mr. Boris Kivdemer. Both Vera and Davis provided a wealth of operational and communications detail in relation to Kavkaz 2020. I really cannot emphasize enough the breadth and depth of their analysis, notably in relation to the communications aspects of that activity, in my view, uniquely so. Boris, meanwhile, contributed a dedicated digital survey with a focus on the representation of Kavkaz 2020 in the international news landscape online and the conversations on social media. So why Kavkaz 2020 and what's it all about, as it were? In 2020, Russia conducted what it termed its major strategic command post and field exercise, Kavkaz 2020, part of its annual cycle of such events. Notionally, the exercise centered around Russia's southern parts, its southern military district. It also encompassed the Caspian Flotilla as a naval element and the Black Sea Fleet as a second naval element. Just a brief digression to know that the other members of this annual exercise family include, as Marius also mentioned, Center, Vostok, and Zapad, to denote where action takes place. So, for example, in 2017, we had Zapad 2017 in the western part of Russia. In 2018, we had Vostok 2018 in Russia's east. 2019 saw Center 2019 in the central military district. And 2020, Kavkaz 2020. Oh, incidentally, the last two exercises, Vostok 2018 and Center 2019, as well as that other exercise Marius mentioned, the strategic deterrence / nuclear exercise, Grom 2019, were examined separately by Vera, Davis, and me in a previous paper dedicated to the CCOE, as Marius was mentioned. In military terms, the Kavkaz 2020 scenario was overall designed to exercise the ability to defend against concentrated massive air and missile strike launched by near-peer adversary. But in addition to the practical elements, a nation's military exercises, especially strategic, are also an important form of communication to really a wide array of audiences, including adversaries, allies, partners, the nation's own population and like, and as well as demonstrating capabilities, military exercises thus support political, military, and geopolitical intents. Thus, please allow me to highlight at least some of the key communications findings the paper sets out. There really is quite a wealth of detail, and for anyone really interested in the matter, please have a look at the paper. It's magnificent. Here, by communications findings, what I really mean is the primary messages and narratives associated with Kavkaz 2020. And these fall into two main categories, just to provide a brief overview, a broad overview. One is naturally the military messages associated with that activity, and the second category is the main geopolitical messages. I think overall, the core connotation can be expressed as follows. It was a display of firepower in support of Russia's claim to the status of global power with its own sphere of interest and/or influence, plus the ability to forge international military and political partnerships, notably with China, a prominent participant in that exercise, but also with Belarus. The paper discusses both these aspects in great detail and does a really good job of that. Militarily, this was also a display of Russia's, technically speaking, power projection and network-centric warfare capabilities with an ability to operate on two fronts and conduct a sophisticated theater-level operation. Overall, the exercise was designed to impress and thus to communicate with its dramatic theatrical displays of firepower on a dedicated day. And as the report contends, moreover, it also served as a final test of Russia's military reform process, which is now more than a decade long. As such, as well as for other reasons, also pointed out in the report in greater detail, it was personally important to the two top military officials in the Russian Federation, those two who have overseen this reform for much of the decade, Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, and Valery Gerasimov, the head of the armed forces. In brief, the primary messages, if I may put it that way, were as follows. Allow me to share a screen for the first of several slides here. These were that Kavkaz 2020 was a defensive exercise, first and foremost. The second primary message could be expressed as that Russia is a global power. Message number 3 is that Russia has a sphere of interest and influence of its own. Message number 4, not necessarily in order of priority, but there you are. Russia's military is among the best in the world. And as the final element of those primary messages associated with the exercise and in view of the situation last year and this year, it was that Russia is able to cope with COVID-19 and its forces are able to wage wars even in a pandemic. Within each of these primary messages, shall we say, Each contained a variety of what can be described as sub-narratives. For example, under defensive, Russia took great pains to craft a defensive, transparent and benign image of the exercise. Narratives that included elements such as Russia as a transparent military power with other nations and organizations about its military activities. Another sub-narrative there that Russia stands for peace but is forced to defend itself against the aggression of others, for example, NATO and even Ukraine. Under the heading of Russia as a global power, the aim, the report concludes, was to communicate both desire and intent to unite and form powerful regional alliances for future military operations. Sub-narratives there included elements such as Russia as a country able to attract other nations and create and lead alliances and coalitions. Please recall the roles of China and others involved, notably Belarus. Yet another element there was the depiction of Russian President Vladimir Putin as a world leader competent in military affairs. In the third primary message of Russia with a sphere of interest and influence of its own, the aim, the report concludes, was to pitch Kavkaz 2020 as an illustration of Russia's ability to project power to Russia's areas of interest. And the sub-narratives there included elements such as, for example, Russia is a deeply integrated militarily with Belarus. Please also know that broadly at the same time, yet another exercise element, Slavic Brotherhood 2020, took place. Yet another sub-narrative there was that with Abkhazia and South Ossetia both involved, I think the image conveyed was that these were de facto, apologies once again, under Russian military control. Under the heading of Russia's military as among the best in the world, obviously one of the main functions of exercises like this, the clear aim was to convey Russia's image of military might, operational readiness, and ability to adapt and modernize. And of those sub-narratives that were discerned there, these included elements such as the conduct of military reform, which has successfully been completed and the armed forces renewed. Russia's military and its ability to run highly coordinated large-scale joint operations, and elements such as Russia as successfully rearming its forces with new and modernized weapons and equipment. Finally, the heading of Russia able to cope with COVID-19 and its forces' ability to wage wars in a pandemic speaks really for itself. And as the final element of the paper, yet last but not least, as it were, a dedicated digital survey was conducted, and the findings there were quite interesting. We all recall that last year there were multiple ongoing conflicts, protracted wars, geopolitical crises, strategic competitions, and this was all reflected on how Kavkaz 2020 was represented in the digital arena. So the scope and scale of flashpoints, such as, if you recall, the war in the Nagorno-Karabakh, the disputed region between Armenia and Azerbaijan, other conflicts such as protests in Belarus, Russia's operations near or in Ukraine, and even the prolonged strategic competition in South Asia, Pakistan and India. It all dictated that Kavkaz 2020 was really overwhelmingly represented, not in its own right, but alongside other geopolitical events. So regional events that clearly affected the narration in relation to Kavkaz 2020 included elements such as, for example, the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh, as I mentioned, including Turkish influence, Russia's role in Ukraine, and even such seemingly unrelated sphere as the India-Pakistan strategic competition. Also, as part of the digital landscape survey, we found that mentions of NATO, the EU, the UN, the OSCE Minsk Group for Nagorno-Karabakh, and the US Department of State were among other elements where Kavkaz 2020 was mentioned in relation to other concurrent events. And in one particular strand, material from Kavkaz 2020 was also used to claim establishment of a new Asia-centric military alliance against the United States and NATO. So really, this in brief is the racing through of the main points set out in the report, and I would like to conclude also by broadening the scale a little bit and mentioning that, as Marius also mentioned, this year Russia is to hold yet another in its cycle of annual strategic exercises. This time that cycle moves west for Zapad 2021. Already several focal points could be identified in relation to Zapad 21, something to watch out for in this context. One is, once again, the events in Belarus. The second is perhaps the military status of Kaliningrad, Russia's western exclave. And the third is, I would contend, Ukraine, which remains the center of attention in the region, in Russia's western parts. So all are along the western periphery of Russia, which extends notionally from the Kola Peninsula in the northwest and Russia's Nordic borders, and as we move down south, the Baltic region, Belarus, and finally Ukraine, the Black Sea, and Crimea. So really watch the space for any Russian communications that emanate from Russia in relation to these spaces as we head towards Zapad 2021. And these activities will no doubt include an information campaign ahead of NATO's Defender Europe 2021, late spring and early summer. And in this context, it's interesting that Zapad 2021 has already been described on Russian television in one program at least as a Russian response to Defender Europe, even though temporarily and otherwise it's not quite that. Zapad also has a history of nuclear elements associated with the holding of those exercises. Such an element, for example, was openly communicated with Zapad 1999. And such an element was alleged but not communicated with Zapad 2009. Again, as it were, watch this space. At least one Russian media outlet, a pro-Kremlin affair, has already claimed in a report I would describe as hype that nuclear use will be rehearsed. Well, we'll see what happens anyway. So that is something to watch out for in relation to these exercises. And with that, I thank you, Marius, and back to you.
Thank you, Valera, for your short overview of the new report that's going to be published soon. However, I have a question because I would like to extend that discussion about the previous Kavkaz 2020 exercises. You mentioned digital domain, and yes, there were some subgroups which were basically fighting in information domain, or at least using Kavkaz 2020 as one of the topics to basically push their own narratives. Will this paper show that there were some signs, or at least some traces, that some specialized units which might be employed to push certain narratives on certain target audiences were also behind those communication patterns and narratives in various of regions, just like you pointed out, the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, those clashes and still war ongoing in the eastern part of Ukraine. So will this report show that, yes, the exercises were used as the extension of the Russia's foreign politics to influence certain countries, regions, or target audiences?
Yes, that's a very good question, Marius. And once again, I would like to return to the point that although not clearly of benefit to the owner exercise, shall we say, Kavkaz 2020 as a Russian affair, it was used more by way of inferences by groups associated with particular sets of regional rivalries. So, for example, in the case of Ukraine's social media environment and output in relation to Kavkaz 2020, and this report deals with this element. Most of the messages concerned the portrayal of Kavkaz 2020 as yet another manifestation of a hostile Russia. In the aspects of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, as this report also shows, much of the social media input into the debate was subdivided into two categories. So reports in Armenia were, or reports emanating from Armenia were Russia-friendly, shall we say, whereas reports or social media inputs from Azerbaijan, as this report also notes, concerned two elements. Element number one is that they weren't, by contrast with Armenia, especially Russia-friendly. In fact, it would be described as unfriendly. But at the same time, the second element of that concerned the friendly output towards Turkey, which has played a prominent role in the conflict. So yes, as to whether Russia, for example, employed specific groups to promote the portrayal of Kavkaz 2020 in these contexts, I think that would need to be investigated further in a dedicated manner. But the report does deal with these matters.
Thank you, Valera. So before we start talking to our colleague from Lithuania, Mr. Vaidas Saldžiūnas, I would like to encourage our audience to ask questions, to express your opinion about what you've just heard. If you have anything to ask Valera, who is a member of the paper, please go ahead, and of course we will ask those questions. And now I would like to give a floor to our friend Vaidas Saldžiūnas from Lithuania. Vaidas, you have extensive experience watching Russia's information environment, analyzing how Russia is using information, how Russia is using exercises as tool of basically its own outreach. So in your opinion, did you see anything that Kavkaz 2020 has resonated somehow in Lithuanian information environment, perhaps even in the Baltics information environment? And if not, what are your thoughts why it's not the case? And I know that you was closely monitoring previous Zapad exercises, Zapad 2017, and what should we, this part of the world, the Baltics, the Eastern NATO flank bordering Russia, expect from Zapad 21? Should we expect some information influence operations launched against us, against the allies, or this time Russia might present some new tricks and surprises for us? Vaidas, over.
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me here. As you correctly said, I was monitoring Zapad exercises back in 2017. But as for Kavkaz 2020, we did some research on that. We did represent that in the media, and we saw a bit of that representation near the other websites. It wasn't that much, and obviously for several reasons, because the context matters. First of all, the geography. Now, the Caucasus and the Baltics is a bit further away, and despite the bomber missions over the Belarus, there wasn't really much happening closer here as compared to the Zapad. Now, the Belarus crisis by its own obviously had some impact to this, to show some attention here, closer to the borders, as Lukashenko saber-rattling and calling Lithuania and Poland openly hostile, even attempting to grab Rodno, etc., having training camps here in Lithuania and Belarus. That was a bit of a, more attention shown towards this area. And then the third reason, I think, is the Zapad lessons themselves. Now, I think I share a bit of a responsibility towards it. And this responsibility doesn't mean it's on the negative side. It's really a point of view, how you look at it. It matters on the recipient's end and on the context. So the context, for example, is in Lithuania at least, that up to 2008 war in Georgia, and especially in 2014 events in Ukraine, the Russian exercises didn't really pay that much attention. The Lithuanian media and the Lithuanian public didn't pay that much attention towards the Russian exercises elsewhere. Maybe it looked even a bit of a nuisance, sort of a joke, remembered by the Russian comedian Mikhail Zadornov, who said that Baltic states should fear Russian exercises more than they should fear Russian army, because during the exercises some drunk and other mishaps may happen. And well, Zapad actually did show that it sometimes is true with the helicopter accident there. But after 2014, we started to pay more attention towards what's Russia doing, especially with a closer look towards Russian snap exercises. It was, if you remember the time when phrases like Suwalki Gap was coined, sort of a reminiscent of the Cold War days, the Fulda Gap, and those Cold War warriors were happy to be relevant again. Then we had plenty of disinformation attacks against NATO troops, amplifying Russian forces here in the region, their role. And then we also had the famous, or one could say infamous, RAND reports about the Baltic capitals falling in 16 hours or less after the Russian onslaught. So when you have all that mixed up together, you have a bit of a tension, you have a vacuum of real information and a lot of room for speculations. And so this offered several ways to cover it. You could do the usual traditional way of relying on foreign press reports, press releases, etc. Or you could start analyzing by your own with your background knowledge. And that's what's something unfamiliar to the general population here. You mentioned the Cold War Fulda Gap, and a lot of people don't know about that. You mentioned 1999 and 2009 Zapad exercises with a nuclear element in it, like nuking Warsaw, and a lot of people are surprised that that sort of thing happened during the exercise. Then you mentioned even Tom Clancy and its Red Storm Rising, amazing book, obviously work of fiction, but it's a very good example of what happens when the exercise ends and what happens next. So with as often with large swaths of information, there's a lot of speculations and misinterpretations coming online, not only online, because then enter the politicians and talking could and taking could for would definitely happen gets things spiraling out of control. And obviously the Zapad organizers back in 2017 were only happy to help us in this. I remember when then General Belkonyev from the Belarusian Armed Forces presented a sort of an idea of what we should expect from the exercises, and this idea of Vaishnoria sort of came into mind. It was a complete surprise because normally in the exercises you would definitely see fictional sort of countries. You would see North versus South, East versus West, and the red forces versus blue forces. But here you can see clearly uncanny familiarity with geography, then with names. Vaishnoria represented something close to Lithuanian name. Lithuania was transformed into Vesbaria, and then north of Poland into Lubenia. And all that seemed to be rather confusing. Why would they choose that? A lot of, again, speculation coming out, because Vaishnoria happens to be mainly the area in Belarus where in 1994 Lukashenko loses the elections but wins in general sense. And then you have a traditional way of saying, what's the point of this exercise? Well, traditionally, like in 2009, as is in 2014, you have some terrorist groups forming somewhere, and the joint forces of Belarus and Russia counterattacking those groups, striking them with a deadly force, and obviously winning the battle. So it looked like those provocateurs in Vaishnoria and Vesbaria would play just the same role for the oppressors and offenders. Now, with that said, one should always remember that the tensions already were high in Lithuania, as I mentioned, with the politicians sort of spiking that up. And very important thing was communication. And we have misfortunate experiences with miscommunication, as back in 2014, then our defense minister said to the population that you should sleep calmly, and wasn't really a reassuring message, because of, there was definitely not really calm situation around us. The armed forces were not in the best of shapes, underfunded for many years. And then finally the exercise happens. And I was there in Belarus in two training areas, Nosipovich and Rozhany, and the picture was pretty clear. The Belarusians were really on the defensive side, sort of in a way that they try to represent this as a very defensive exercise in nature, etc., and Russians are our friends. It was very, very clear from the beginning that they're not just friends, they are older brother, they are senior brother in the exercise. And during that time, it was possible to even see that by evidence or by your own eyes, because when I went to Osipovich training area, I could see that man in the picture in the middle with the radio station. That's actually then Colonel Kolesnikov, commanding the 4th Guards Army of the Russian Federation. He was giving orders to the Belarusian generals. So it was a bit of an odd now, the colonel giving orders to the Belarusian generals. And this sort of idea of Russians sort of running the show was not just sort of strange enough, but it soon turned out that this whole initial scenario of Vesbaria, Veshnori, and the rest was just pure nonsense, because they were quite open about it, what this exercise was really about. It's about striking enemy communication. It's about striking enemy airfields, striking enemy ships, and countering enemy cruise missile attacks. No non-conventional enemies like terrorists would possess such capabilities. And obviously, it all ended with spectacular Iskander-K launches in Kapustin Yar, and obviously with some additional exercises which were officially not part of the Zapad in Central, Southern Military District, as well as Northern Fleet. So I guess the big picture, the big question today is, how will Zapad 2021 transpire? Will they choose this scenario, this big play, as they did back in 2021 with disinfo attacks, with trying to present it? Obviously, we already can see that much of the gains will happen in Belarus itself, and with the recent autumn crisis in Belarus and Russian support, you can expect a lot of things. But I think that lessons of Zapad have shown us probably that we have grown since then. But when some people said that they were genuinely afraid of Zapad turning into something real, and I received a lot of questions myself, will this transpire? And I think I said probably, most likely, no. But the fears were real. I do not believe that the fear of the sort exists at this very moment. And that story with the crying wolf is quite an educative one.
So thank you, Vaidas, for your thoughts, and we start receiving first questions. And I know that you, Vaidas, same as most of the Lithuanian journalists, are standing in the front line, basically, coping with disinformation, with misinformation, with fake news attempts. And lots of things have changed since war in Ukraine broke up. In Lithuania, in the Baltic states, as well as in Poland, we have NATO enhanced forward presence, and our online audiences, on behalf of Annalisa Maryland, is asking, have you identified that in regards to upcoming Zapad 2020 exercises, that there is an increase in disinformation or misinformation attempts and campaigns targeting particularly NATO allied presence in the Baltic states? Is there a case already, or we should wait for that once the exercises is going to be closer and closer?
Well, for the past few years, let's say from Zapad, we've been noticing that disinformation attacks against NATO troops or NATO in general, Baltic states, and say they were coming in waves. There was no way sort of 100% predicting of when the attacks will happen. Normally, you could say, yes, there are national celebration days or some events like exercises would attract disinformation campaigns, but they don't come as such always. And of late, I wouldn't say that there's anything specific. I would even say that last year we had even more disinfo attacks than this year. But just it's impossible to speculate on what the let's say what the Kremlin information tactics and strategies will be this time before Zapad. We've seen novelties. Well, it's by itself, it's not a novelty, but spoofing emails, trying to hack news websites, put some false information. So that was a trend for the past few years in Lithuania. Now it's spilling out into the other countries. So I guess that we could probably see something like that more.
Yeah, so indeed, so information environment remains the ground for the information attacks and defenses, and I'm really glad that a number of journalists, such as you did a great job in educating the societies, the people, and not to be so afraid as I saw by myself what was happening, at least in Lithuania during Zapad 2017. Valera, I would like to ask you a question. Our previous report on Center Vostok exercises, we were emphasizing that basically, despite Russia was attempting to show that it is transparent, it is open about its military activities. However, the findings from the report showed that there is kind of significant amount of uncertainty that the exercises were not as transparent as Russia was trying to build the image about. So was this the case with Kavkaz 2020 exercises, or because of the critiques on Vostok and Center exercises, Russia made some adjustments and they start speaking more open, inviting or allowing international verificators and observers to attend the exercises in number of locations, not only those which were chosen by the exercise planners. So was this the case during Kavkaz 2020, or once again?
Yes. In fact, our report on Kavkaz 2020 deals with these aspects in a great amount of detail, as did the previous report, which focused on Center and Zapad. And well, to give you one example specifically in relation to Kavkaz 2020, in a slide unveiled by the Russian Ministry of Defense in relation to participant hardware numbers and so on and so forth in relation to Zapad 2020, the figure given was, let me double check that, of 80,000 participants from Russia in the exercise itself, and here we're talking about Kavkaz 2020. Now, it should be recalled the so-called Vienna document from the year 2011 stipulates an upper ceiling of 13,000 personnel for an exercise. So a paradox arose in relation to Kavkaz 2020, whereby we have the Vienna document requirement of a ceiling of 13,000 personnel, which in previous years Russia has studiously tried to adhere to. Whether in fact it happened is another matter. Whereas in that year, for Kavkaz 2020, the figure openly admitted on the one hand, or at first glance, was 80,000 personnel. Somewhat implausibly, the argument submitted by Russia at the time was that of the 80,000 personnel involved in the exercise, what it termed as the number of those involved under a single operational command did not exceed the 13,000 troop level stipulated by the Vienna document of 2011, and that the rest of the forces, let us say the bulk of 70,000 service personnel, were involved either in some other capacity as logistical or support troops, or in fact in the regions outside the Vienna document 2011 zone of application. And it's an interesting paradox because as the paper mentions, and the previous papers in relation to Center and Vostok exercises also singles out. In previous years, the Russian effort has always aimed to put it across that the number of participants is well within the Vienna document ceilings, although subsequently reports would begin to emerge that would hint at the far larger number of participants, but that was unofficial. On this occasion, as this report on Kavkaz 2020 makes clear, the figure put out officially was 80,000, but with that caveat that under a single operational command, the ceiling was not breached, and other forces were involved. So it really is quite a good question as to why the Russian Federation decided to opt for this particular information maneuver in this case, whether, for example, it was decided to be blatant about it or for some other reason. The report does deal with it and does try to ascertain that. So yes, that was the situation of Kavkaz. And of course, with Zapad 2021, similar misgivings and concerns are bound to arise. Will there be a major group of forces created in the west of the Russian Federation so as to take part? Will the number of Belarusian participants be added to the number of Russian participants, and so on and so forth? So that's yet another dynamic to watch in relation to Zapad 2021.
Thank you, Valera. I see more and more questions are popping up from our viewers, and this time I would like to ask Vaidas, first of all. So, Vaidas, I'm sure that you are aware that Russia is pushing hard those messages about the upcoming Zapad exercises, and of course with certain aims and goals targeting number of audiences, both internal audiences in Russia and within its own allies or partners, as well as to the potential adversaries. So, in your opinion, what is the hidden, perhaps, goal or aim of Russia behind that push of the messaging, push of the exercises to the information environment? Is Russia trying to basically to force the West, perhaps even the NATO, to react to Russia to what Russia is willing to do, basically kind of reflexive control, or basically they would like to divert the attention from internal problems which Russia faces at the moment? So what is your call about that?
Well, I guess both theories, even classical ones. The second one, that ever Russia faces some economical backlash or problems, they would try to have a simplified happy little war, or at least, very least, to have enemies abroad that are trying to sort of strangle Mother Russia. But also, it was never really a secret, the strategy to divide NATO and to split it and even cause some confusion within member states. And they've been trying, I mean, okay, when I say they, it's never 100% sure who's they behind some of the disinfo attacks that are cyber related, for instance, because you may have some footprints, but they not necessarily lead to certain country. However, when it gets represented in specific media outlets inside Russia, controlled by Russian Federation or tied to Russian Federation, you clearly see the patterns that it's always pretty the same story that has been for years and years, that NATO is evil, that is creating more military bases. Thus, Russia must respond with its own deployments and with its own exercises. And by years, I think the more this message is becoming more and more clear. Now, Kavkaz was, the last year by itself was a bit of an exception in that regard, that they tried to, or the Russian Federation tried to, some approaches towards NATO that would ease tensions with some promises of non-deploying certain weapon systems from the already dead INF Treaty, for instance. And other sort of deployments that they promised not to do. But those preconditions seem to be more like near ultimatums rather than any realistic sort of realistic bargaining approaches. And NATO has shown no signal whatsoever that we will back down in that regard. So in the end, so far, all the strategies have failed, and there is always a room for more aggressive behavior from the Russian Federation to justify, it's becoming already a March 1st tradition since 2018 to present new weapon systems and to test those weapon systems, since Russian armed forces has been on the peak of their modernizing after 2008, this huge and large and long-term reform is now entering a new phase.
I have a question for you, once again, replying to one of our viewers. So, yes, indeed, Russia is pushing hard number of messages to number of target audiences inside Russia, outside Russia. So what is your take on, so what is that target audiences that Russia is trying to reach, basically, to put something that is willing to tell? Are these the decision makers, some advisors, military thinkers, think tanks perhaps, or the military leadership? And of course, going down to the average citizens who live the countries bordering Russia, are there any specific target audiences that Russia is trying to reach through really intense and active communication about the upcoming Zapad exercises?
Sorry, is that a question to me, Marius? Yeah? Did I hear
Yes,
it
Valer,
right?
I would like you to answer this question.
Okay.
Valera, we don't hear you.
I do beg your pardon. If we were to compare Russia's, or the targets of Russia's information maneuvers to, let's say, a restaurant menu, I would say that Russia is quite omnivorous in its approach to what targets it chooses. I wouldn't say it's indiscriminate, but its approach appears to be quite comprehensive. And I would say that it targets, in geographical terms, both NATO as a whole, the United States in particular, but also individual members of the alliance, or those that could one day aspire to join the alliance. So to deal with this point in particular, for example, one of the latest reports we have seen is that a report by one Russian media outlet posits that the United States and its as it's framed, an excessively aggressive policy in relation to Russia might well drive Norway to quit the alliance as the danger of war increases, for example. So we have a clear attempt by a segment of the Russian media to target Norway and its perception of NATO membership. The same in the past can be said about, for example, countries like Sweden as a target of an information campaign in relation to NATO. And as I say, NATO as a whole is a target of continuous, information maneuver, shall we say, continuous. There is a continuous sub-narrative, a continuous undercurrent of reports critical of NATO, and it seems to be that this perception gap is not one to be overcome. So as NATO claims Russia's aggressive behavior, Russia doesn't really bother to deny that, but in fact wheels out accusations of its own, of NATO's aggressive behavior. So one point the Kavkaz 2020 report singles out is that concurrent with Russian state media reporting on the holding of Kavkaz 2020, there was a concerted attempt by the Russian state media and other social media and other sections of the media to once again attract attention to NATO's behavior. So as the report says, when you hold not to say an aggressive, but a strategic military exercise, others will observe. So the time Kavkaz 2020 took place, NATO naturally mounted observation and surveillance missions to sniff out what is important and behave quite naturally, shall we say. If you listen to Russian media, if you listen to Russian TV in particular, at the time September, October 2020. The discourse was about NATO's aggressive behavior, NATO's flights here, there, and everywhere, NATO's surveillance aircraft over the Black Sea, over the Baltic Sea, and even if memory serves me correctly, over the Bering Strait. So, you know, the depiction was of this bloc hostile to Russia in action just at the time Kavkaz 2020 took place, which in terms of this, in a way, the justification for the holding of Kavkaz 2020, perhaps on a scale that it was held. So to come back to the question, yes, everything and everybody is a target potentially of Russia's information operation, shall we say. I hope it answers your question at least to some extent.
Yes, thank you, Valera. So we know that Zapad 21 will be exercised not only in Russia, Belarus, its ally, will also be part of the exercises. So Belarus, of course, keeping in mind what was happening last year in Belarus, and that was one of the official narratives of Minsk, that NATO is about to attack. Certain countries have some historical kind of claims to the lands which currently belong to Belarus. And matching that with the upcoming exercises, will we, NATO, be portrayed as potential aggressor, and that Russia, together with Belarus, during the exercises Zapad 21, will be forced to defend of potential attack on one of the allied states? So can you see that these kinds of narratives are already prevailing or start to prevail in the information environment, those messaging coming from Moscow, perhaps even Belarus? Vidas, have you noticed something while observing Russian information environment?
Well, so far, no. So far, there's little about Zapad 2021. There are obviously such rumors coming out in certain outlets trying to push that sort of agenda. But it's sort of a more inertia and continuation of what happened in 2020 autumn when Lukashenko regime tried to sort of play with this anti-NATO message. He did that not for the first time, and the good bet is that it's not for the last time, meaning that this message of aggressive NATO surrounding Belarus and brotherly nation of Russia supposedly need to defend that brotherly nation, especially during the Zapad exercise. That could be definitely sort of employed, but so far there's very little really about Zapad 2021. I mean, it will probably play out for better times coming closer to the exercise itself.
And Valera, I would like you to ask, since you mentioned that nuclear element of the previous exercises, in your estimation, will Russia once again use that element of its strategic might during the Zapad 21 exercises, or once again they will keep that as potential joker in the card, as the card?
Yes, that's quite a complex, potentially area of study. As I have mentioned in my initial pitch, we had an openly declared nuclear element to Zapad 1999. For example, in one report I have investigated recently, an article in Независимое военное обозрение, the military supplement to Независимая газета, back in 1999, openly spoke about a flight, if I'm not mistaken, by two Tu-160 supersonic strategic bombers of the United Kingdom, which rehearsed, it's not a literal quote, but it's more or less a quote, which rehearsed a missile launch and or nuclear strike off the northern coast of the United Kingdom. Now, the phraseology was such that it was impossible to ascertain whether the UK was the target or some others, but the location was important. So that was in 1999. In 2009, Vidas, I think, mentioned a very specific element of a nuclear element in that exercise, the nuking of Warsaw. Now, that report was never officially avowed by the Russian Federation as an exercise element, at least not to my knowledge. In subsequent Zapad exercises, I'm not particularly certain about the extent of their nuclear elements, but what I can say about Zapad 2021, looking ahead to that exercise, is that if I may allow myself a small digression, increasingly the discourse in or among the Russian military has been towards the adoption of what is referred to as non-nuclear strategic deterrence. So in the case of Russia, we have a number of well-publicized systems such as the sea-launched Kalibr cruise missile or the ground-launched Iskander, a short-range, quote-unquote, ballistic and cruise missile. So those two systems in particular have been described and I believe to be dual capable, that is to say conventionally armed and nuclear armed variants I believe to exist. So I would posit that in the case of Zapad 2021 too, Russia may feel less of a need to cyber rattle in nuclear terms, but instead rely on the implicit dual capability of systems such as the Kalibr and the Iskander and confine itself to those elements because realistically, even conventionally armed variants of those potent weapons would be, as Russia judges, a deterrent enough. But we'll see what happens. Of course, to expect a full official recognition of any nuclear element would be a mistake in my view, because Russia hasn't done that for a while. It is not another matter that in the case of Grom 2019, the strategic deterrence exercise, there was a very detailed breakdown of all the systems involved, of all the nuclear elements of the exercise, which culminated in all-out nuclear war, more or less. So we'll see what happens after 2021, but my bet is Russia will confine itself to the Kalibr. It's exercising. The Iskander is exercising, given its deployment in Kaliningrad, things like that.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I see that our time is about up, so I have one final question for Vidas. Vidas, since you're fully aware what was happening in 2017 Zapad exercises, that societies, at least in Lithuania, they were concerned, really concerned about what is happening, how Russia is communicating the exercises, and how our opinion leaders are also pushing those messages. So in your opinion, are we more resilient in terms of information influence activities, or the fact that we have NATO allies located in the Baltic states? We have really strong connections with our strategic allies. Will our societies be less stressed about the exercises which are going to take place next to the Lithuanian boundaries, or once again we should be facing something similar, that enormous amount of messaging and almost crying the river, just as you said? Over to you.
Well, I would have I guess three arguments for this, and then one worry. So the first argument would be yes, we are more resilient because of the experiences of 2017 and the subsequent exercises. We know more. Secondly, obviously, the deployment of NATO and particular allies, especially the Americans in the region, are clearly visible. Even today, there was a flight of B-1 bomber, sort of a reassurance mission over the Baltic capitals. Sort of a symbolic gesture, not the first one, but you had a lot of positive feedback online, at least. That happened just a couple hours ago. Also, to that point, I would add that intelligence and reconnaissance missions over the Baltic states, in the Baltic region, are very visible. Intelligence and reconnaissance aircraft from NATO countries and non-NATO countries like Sweden and Finland are flying very frequently, very visibly with transponders on. and monitoring Kaliningrad and Belarus very, very closely. And that openness is also a signal. And the third probably reason is less related, but well, you know, we have a whole year, and we still have time to worry about other things, about the COVID situation, post-COVID trauma situation. And it's just not enough in many of us to worry about something that is possibly to some trivial. However, if it has shown anything, that unexpected things can happen, and they do happen. And when they do happen, well, there's a bit of a crisis, and there are lots of lessons to be learned. So the worry is that some people may not have learned the lesson, and there may be attempts, sort of try to push to new boundaries during Zapad, before Zapad, after Zapad exercise. But, you know, as I mentioned, there are three reasons against one, so I'd rather be more optimistic on that front.
Oh, thank you, Vaidas, and I would like to thank both of you. So our speakers that we had today is Mr. Valery Akimenko from Conflict Studies Research Center in the United Kingdom, and the journalist who is writing on defense and security issues, specializing on Russia, Mr. Vaidas Saldžiūnas from largest online media group Delphi in Lithuania and the Baltic States. So thank you, our audience, for those who joined us for this webinar, and I would like to announce that the next week, on the 10th of March, another really interesting topic is going to be discussed in the studio. And this time we will be discussing disinformation in the Central and the Eastern Europe. So thank you for joining us, and see you in the future.